My name is Alexandria George. I'm here to introduce Mr. Chris Horst. He works with Hope International, and for the last 10 years, he's been filling many different roles with them. Currently, he is the Vice President of Development. As in this position, he gets to employ his passions for advancing initiatives at the intersect of entrepreneurship and the gospel. In addition to his role at Hope, he serves on the board of the Denver Institute for Faith and Work and the Colorado Microfinance Alliance. He's been published in Christian Today and has co-authored Mission Drift with Peter Greer. He received his BS in business and has an MBA as well. He has a wife and 2 sons with a third on the way, and they live in Denver, Colorado. So please help me welcome Mr. Chris Horst.
Thank you. Thanks. It's fun to be here. Maybe just to start today, I'd love to just take a second and have you think about gleaning. We're going to talk about gleaning today, which is a practice that we read about in Scripture that probably don't spend a lot of time each day and each week thinking about. But I want you to just think about gleaning. Think about some of your preconceived notions about it, what you know about it. Just reflect a little bit on gleaning, because that's what we're going to talk about today. I love being on Asbury's campus. I got in last night, was able to walk around a little bit this afternoon and enjoy a great lunch today at the Solomon's Porch, which was fun. And I've really enjoyed being here. This is a great part of my role that I get to come to places like Asbury. But I'm going to be honest with you, I don't enjoy every part of my job. And in fact, one of the things I'm supposed to like, now I work for an organization called Hope International, and one of the things I'm expected to like is traveling abroad. But to be honest with this group of friends here, I don't like traveling internationally. I really like the amenities and luxuries of American life. I love air conditioning. I like having a time zone that my body comprehends. Most of the time, I really like democracy. But traveling, it's just a part of my job. And so I have to do it. And I travel internationally. And I do it even though I don't always love it. And I felt this maybe most acutely a few years ago when I traveled to India. Has anyone here been to India? A number of you. Yeah. So the more brave travelers among us may love traveling to India. But for me, I knew as soon as I got out of the airport in Mumbai that I was going to struggle with being in India. I was a little bit claustrophobic. The heat, the smells, the humidity, just the sheer mass of people everywhere. It was really hard for me. And then we left Mumbai and went to the city where Hope works, and we took one of the main highways and then pulled off that highway and got out of the bus, and we walked down into one of the slum communities in that city where Hope works. And this is where I was really feeling it. If you've ever seen Slumdog Millionaire or seen a documentary about India, you know the sort of community I'm talking about. And the houses slammed up against each other, open fires for cooking, tin roofs, there's open sewage. It was really, really hot. And we wound our way back through this slum community into the center of the community where a group of women were gathered in a circle, and they're the women that we serve in that neighborhood. And they started the meeting, and I was there with a group of donors, and it started normally enough, but shortly after the meeting began, 2 other women, not a part of the group, came and they interrupted our meeting. And so I'm there, and we're sort of observing it through the translator, catching on what's happening, but you could tell just by the body language that these 2 women were upset. And they started interacting in a pretty heated manner with the women that we serve. And they started complaining about how terrible their community is. So they just started lamenting the fact that they had so much poverty, they had sickness, they had lack of education, that they were ignored by the police, ignored by the government. There was violence, they had porous homes. All of the people that struggled with disabilities, with the lepers, they talked about they were just sort of left or pushed into this community. And they just described their place that they lived as the worst place imaginable. And as they were sharing, we learned that, in fact, there was a name for this village. And most of these communities don't have a formal address, a formal name, but they had chosen for themselves a name. And the name they chose for the community was Helpless. And I want to think about how desperate you must be to be in a community, in a neighborhood, where you get together with your neighbors and pick the name Helpless. But that's what they had chosen. That was what they had picked for their town's name. But I'll be really honest with you. It wasn't an irrational choice. to call their community helpless. Because as I was there, the condition more than any place that I've ever been in the world, it felt helpless. Now we have all been there. Maybe not in that specific community, but we've all been in front of someone or been somewhere where we're experiencing someone who's helpless, someone who feels desperate. Maybe it's with a family member who continues to make bad decisions, or perhaps it's been in a community somewhere near here where you've interacted with people or with a place that just feels desperate, just feels like things are hard. And all of us have encountered this. All of us have encountered helplessness and desperation. And for the last 10 years, as part of my work, I travel and I meet with people, with pastors and leaders, friends, family members, peers, and talk to them about hope and talk to them about what's happening in their lives. And everyone I've met is going through something with someone or some place where they're experiencing desperation. And generally over the course of that time, I can categorize the way I've heard these folks respond and the way I've responded in 3 ways. And a 4th way we'll talk about later. But total of 4 ways. These are the 3 ways that are most common. First, we chide. Either consciously or maybe subconsciously, many of us, when we encounter people or places that are desperate, we chide. We blame them for the plight that they're in. We bootstrapped our way out of poverty. Why can't they? The same path that was available to me is available to them. That's the first response. The second is we escape. Sometimes we experience poverty and we just can't live with it. We want to wall ourselves in and indulge in life's luxuries, pulling back from the pain because we just don't want to reckon with poverty. It's too weighty. It seems unbearable, so we escape. And the third way that I've seen most commonly is that we solve. We visit a struggling community like helpless, and we instantly get to work trying to find solutions for all of their problems. We build houses, we feed them meals, we send them clothes, we rally our friends and family and twist arms of our church and try and find ways to fix all the problems that exist for them. Now, these 3 responses aren't entirely bad. We certainly agree that all people are responsible to try. Some people even need to be chided to try. The Apostle Paul himself was the one that said that he who does not work should not eat. And escaping isn't all bad either. Sometimes we need to retreat from the pain that we see in others and in other places. Even Jesus pulled away for Sabbath and for rest. And solving, well, it's gross negligence to not attempt to try and find solutions to the problems that exist in places like helpless. Those problems demand that we try and do something to help them to fix the problems that exist there. But each of these 3 responses, when we chide, when we escape, or when we solve, each of them falls flat by itself. So how should we respond? Well, I think we have a great model in gleaning, as we talked about earlier, and how we can respond to the problems in our midst. So let's think about gleaning. When God made his initial promise to Abraham, the patriarch of God's people, he said this. He said, I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you, not some of the families, but all of the families of the earth shall be blessed. Right from the beginning, God established that his people were not to be a holy enclave or a city walled up and warring against its neighbors. But it says, God promises, in you, all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Not some of them, not your families, all the families of the earth shall be blessed. He repeats this exact same promise to Isaac, which surprises me, thinking about our Old Testament. That the design, the promise that God gave is that his people would be a blessing to their neighbors, to all the families of the earth. I think this is really important because when we look at our scriptures, when we read the stories that God's given to us in his word, we have to know, first and foremost, that God intended his people to be a refuge for those around them. God's people were to be a safe haven for all people. And the correct response, I believe, to poverty and to desperation today is the same as that it was then with Abraham and Isaac. How did God challenge his people to respond to the people that were desperate in that time? God said, I want you to open. I want you to be open with what I've given you. So here's what it looked like then. I asked you to think about gleaning, and here's what God instructs specifically and practically to his people. Now you have to remember that the most wealthy people in the land at that time that were receiving God's word, they were the landowners. These are the farmers. These are the people that had the most. And I would guess that most of you, like me in this room, you spend more of your time at coffee shops and behind computer screens than you do behind a plow at a farm. So it can feel funny to hear these words, but we're the wealthy. We are the landowners. So let's listen to these words that God gives to us, the commands he gives to his people in Genesis 24. Whenever you are reaping the harvest of your field and you leave some grain in the field, don't go back and get it. Let it go to the immigrants, to the orphans, and the widows, so that the Lord your God blesses you in all that you do. Similarly, when you beat the olives off your olive trees, don't go back over them twice. Let the leftovers go to the orphans, the widows, and the immigrants. And when you pick the grapes off your vineyard, don't pick them over twice. In short, in these few verses, God commands his people to be open with the gifts he's entrusted to them. He asks them to hold in their hands lightly what he has given them with their grain fields and with their olive trees, with their grape vineyards. And you'll notice in this passage that God is crop agnostic. It doesn't matter if they're in the grain business or the vineyard business, the olive business, the command holds true. He challenges the wealthy, the landowners, God's people, to create margin with their assets for the less fortunate, for the immigrants, for the orphans, for the widows. Among God's people, they were to never, ever worry because they were living in a place that was created and designed by God to be a blessing to them. For there were always, among God's people, there were always opportunities for them to work, to provide for themselves and for their families. The beauty of this practice of gleaning is that it requires open-handedness from those with plenty, from the landowners, and it requires hard work from those in need. So 3 questions for all of you today to reflect on. The first question is this: how will you farm? Will we be stingy farmers, looking down on anyone and everyone who lacks our farming expertise? Or perhaps those that don't have a place to farm? Or perhaps we're tempted to buy a farm. Okay, we'll buy a farm, but we're going to buy a farm that's far, far away from anyone who might ever need to glean. We want to make sure that no gleaner can cross onto our property. Or perhaps we're going to get a farm, and we're going to take that farm and process the grain, and then take that processed grain and make it into bread, and then take that bread and go into the city and find the very poorest immigrants, orphans, and widows in the community and give it out to them, and then do it all over again. You start to sense some of the tension here with helping those who are living in desperation. Both here and around the world, it's never as simple as it appears. God's people open. Think about how open that people would have to be when they hear these words. When you beat the olives off your olive trees, don't go back over them twice. Let the leftovers go to the immigrants, the orphans, and the widows. You're leaving profits in the field. You're leaving work, leaving harvest there for others to do. God's people have to take risks. And God's people have to be open with what we've been entrusted. God has blessed us all with farms. And the first step, I think, to serving our neighbors well is to stop beating ourselves up for the fact that God has given us farms. God never blames his people for the farms that he's entrusted to them. They were a gift from God to them. Now, was it a gift, and is it a gift today that we're in this room? Is it a gift that's deserved? Absolutely not. But it's a gift he's given us, so we have to stop self-loathing about the fact that we've been entrusted with a lot, because we can't serve our neighbors well from a position and a posture of guilt. So once we recognize that God has entrusted us with a farm, then we need to get on with the work of being so generous, so wildly open-handed, that people around might see our good works and give glory to our Father, as it says in Matthew 5. And then once we've embraced our roles as farm owners, we must make what God has given us available to the vulnerable. I want to be really clear on this point. We are living in direct contradiction to our faith if we are not making room for the vulnerable around us to fully flourish. Let me share a few examples to help illustrate and put a little color on what I mean when I say God's people open. What does that look like today? Well, two examples. One, my friends Ben and Laura Harrison had a son, Jonas. And they found out shortly after Jonas was born that he was born nearly blind. And so they've walked an incredibly difficult journey with Jonas. And in the midst of it, they've recognized just how embarrassing a visual impairment is for young children. And they realize that one of the biggest barriers is there aren't cool options for kids to have glasses. There aren't options that allow them to be confident. So they created an eyewear company, Jonas Paul Eyewear, to provide really stylish glasses for kids that have visual impairments. For kids just like their son Jonas. The Christian response to everything, even our suffering, even the pain that we're entrusted with and experience, we should be open with that for the benefit of the vulnerable around us. The second example is of a friend, James, who owns a pallet business. James, several years ago, he sensed God was asking him to start opening up his business hiring practices in a way that would benefit the vulnerable in his midst, to open up his hands to give opportunities to those that no one else was concerned about. And so he reached out to the Burmese refugee population in Denver. And fast forward today, just a few years later, after he took that initial risk of opening up his business to the Burmese, 70 of 160 employees at his company, at this pallet business, are Burmese refugees. And the stories he tells about the way that these lives are being changed at his business will take your breath away. Now the employees, James has fallen in love with Burma, with the Burmese people. He's providing citizenship classes and English classes. He has chaplains on staff who speak their local language, who are able to care for them and provide opportunities for them to become better acclimated in our society. James, a pallet business owner, is having an incredible impact through what God's entrusted to him, through his grain field, through his olive orchard. Now, for some of us in the room, hearing stories about Jonas Paul Eyewear and about the pallet company might feel a little bit unattainable. Perhaps you don't own a business right now, or you can't start a business, so you're wondering, how can I practice gleaning in my life? Well, I believe a gleaning mentality is something that we're all called to, no matter what sort of work we're in or stage of life we're in. So the question you have to ask is, what has God entrusted to you? What is your farm? Your relationships? Your homes, your spare bedrooms, your tables, your hardships, your sufferings, your money. God's people are called to open up what we have for the benefit of the vulnerable. So that's the first question, how will you farm? The second question is, what will you farm? A few months ago, I got a phone call. It was from a woman that was a few years out of graduating from a Christian college, and she was really distraught. And so on the phone call, she shared with me that she had entered that Christian college. It wasn't Asbury. She had entered that Christian college as an accounting major and declared as an accounting major. But 2 years in, she went to a missions conference at her school. And at her missions conference, she saw one speaker after another up on the stage. They were all working for Christian nonprofit organizations, working internationally and working in their city. And over the course of the conference, she sensed God was calling her to make some radical decisions to love him, radical decisions to obey and to serve the needy and the vulnerable. And she told me, she's like, I wanted to respond. So at that conference, she made the commitment she was going to change from being an accounting major to being a social work major. And so fast forward a couple of years from that missions conference to when I talked to her, she had graduated as a social work major. She had worked a few years in social work. And as I said to you, when I was talking to her, she was distraught. She was miserable. She was like, on the phone conversation, she said it. She's like, I'm not wired to be a social worker. I'm wired to be an accountant. And she had made that change because she thought that there was no room for accountants among the revolutionaries. That if we want to change the world, then there's no room for someone like me. I have to become someone that I am not. So she had actually decided she was going to go back to school, was starting over, and was going to go finish her accounting degree, because she started to realize that God's gifting wasn't happenstance. It wasn't a mistake that she was really, really good at math. It wasn't a mistake that she was great at looking at debits and credits. And I'm telling you, having interviewed hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of college students over the years, this is the biggest lie that they believe. And that's that certain majors have the market cornered on changing the world. God did not give us gifts accidentally. He did not entrust us and wire us with skills as a mistake. If he wired you for business or education or healthcare or music or construction or for social work, that's not a divine slip-up. That's God's wiring that he's given to you. And a careful reading of Scripture finds that our heroes of the faith are not just professional clergy. Jesus worked 3 times longer in a carpenter's workshop than he did at the pulpit. Paul was a tent maker. Lydia was a seamstress. Daniel and Nehemiah and Joseph, they worked in very high levels in government. The Proverbs 31 woman, she was a real estate investor. So the vocations of Christians today, I believe, should be just as diverse as those of the heroes of our faith. And we have to remember that our significance doesn't come in the major that we're in or the degree we get upon graduation, but it's all dependent on how we use the gifts that God's given us to benefit those around us. The third question then, how will you farm? What will you farm? And the third question is, where will you farm? For those that are seniors and undergrad here in the room, this is probably an imminent question as you're looking at life beyond Wilmore, potentially. Asking the question, where is God calling me to farm? For some of you that maybe are underclassmen, you still have to ask that question, whether it's dorm or where you're going to intern over the summer. And I want to just share a couple of thoughts on geography in the world. I want to diffuse one perception that I hear really regularly when talking with college students. Again, not Asbury students, these are other college students. But one of the perceptions I hear often, and I think that the perception and maybe the misconception that I hear a lot is best captured in a satirical comment that I read recently. The person wrote, "I feel like God is calling me to do something really radical and sacrificial, like move to a trendy neighborhood in a fun major metropolitan city." I read that comment, I thought that is absolutely true. And it's absolutely what I hear so often when I talk to students who are looking to intern or come work for Hope. But the reality is, if you want to change the world and you want to respond to poverty in this country and you want to live among the vulnerable and the marginalized, God might be calling you to go live in the suburbs and get a white picket fence. Because the reality is that the next wave of ministry among the disenfranchised and among the vulnerable in our country, it might not be in the inner city. I'll tell you, it's absolutely true in my city of Denver. Church planners and nonprofit workers and graduates of colleges want to come and give back and help the poor and help the marginalized, and they move into Denver, you're not going to find them. Because our city is changing. And the inner city, as we've traditionally talked about it, it's just not true anymore. And poverty exists where real, concentrated poverty exists in Denver is in the first-ring suburbs. It's in Commerce City. It's in Aurora and Brighton. It's not in Denver proper. Now, this isn't true in every city in the country, but in many places around our country, the demographics are really changing, and they're changing really quickly. The dynamics are also changing internationally. Think about cities like Shanghai and Cape Town and Mexico City and Hong Kong. These are places that 50, 60 years ago would have been considered third world, or they would have been considered really, really poor. And the reality is today, these are cities that are vibrant, sophisticated cities. The divide between cities around the world is a lot less stark than it used to be. Dr. Hans Rosling, who's a Swedish economist, he did this 4-minute video. I don't know how many of you have seen this video, but it's a history of the world in 4 minutes. It's really remarkable. And in that video, one of the specific data points that I latched onto is really fascinating, is around India. And in India, the average life expectancy in 1912, as he shows in the video, is 23 years. And when you fast forward to today, the average life expectancy is 66 years. So over the course of 100 years, the average life expectancy has almost tripled. Similarly with average income. Average inflation, or the average income adjusted for inflation in 1912 was $683. Fast forward 100 years, that income is up to, the average income is $3,300 a year. So this has happened really quickly if you think about the course of human history. If we look at just what's happened in China, it's another incredible story. Wages have increased 71% since 2008. Over the last 30 years, this is crazy, but over the last 30 years, the percentage of Chinese family living in extreme poverty has decreased from 84% down to 10%. To put that into perspective, 680 million Chinese people formerly living on the edge of disaster, this is twice the entire population of the United States, have gone from living at the edge of catastrophe and dying from a stupid death like starvation or diarrhea to living a life no longer in that position. So I share these stats just as a way of exposing that some of the ways we think about poverty here and poverty around the world might not be true. There's still some elements of truth in the perceptions that we hold, but a lot has changed, and a lot has changed really quickly with the surge of capitalism, democracy, and globalization around the world. Where will you farm? If you're passionate about making a difference, it's going to require you think differently about where you're going to farm. What corner of the earth, of this good earth God has given us, has He entrusted to you? I'd like to share one final gleaning example with you. And it's an example of a family that's held their hands open their entire life. It's a story of a man named John. And when John was a young boy, he was born in India, and his father died from a tragic accident when John was very young. And so John's mom, a mother, she was trying to provide for her family and struggling to do so, but she landed a job at an elite private school as a janitor. And at that school, she was able to start putting her kids into the school and providing for them. And John is a really sharp kid. And so John excelled at school and soon got a scholarship to go to a university in India. From there, he got a scholarship to go to the University of Texas. So he moved to Texas, graduated from Texas, and then got a job offer to come work in the private sector. And he worked for a decade, working for companies like Best Buy and American Express. John got married, and along this time, he sensed that God was calling him to consider where he should farm. And what John sensed was that God was calling him and his family to go back to the community where John was born. So John moved back. He moved back in 2008, back to the community where he was born, and he moved back committed to gleaning, to opening up the skills, the abilities, the experiences he's had to benefit the vulnerable in his community. Partnering with Hope International, where I work, John launched a Christ-centered microfinance organization. But shortly after launching, John's ministry has been met with incredible opposition. And so we've had to take a lot of precautions to protect John and his work, because there are radical militant groups in his hometown that have made their living on the backs of the poor. They've thrived at the expense of people living in his community. And John is struggling because the religious elite there, they want to hold the marginalized in bondage. They've lied to these people for generations about who they were created to be. Lied to them that they were destined to experience extreme poverty. John and his colleagues working with Hope International have been threatened. They've had a few of their employees thrown in jail. But the work they're doing in practice is actually really, really simple. What they're doing there and what we're doing in the 16 countries where Hope works is providing three simple things. The first is biblically based business training. The second is an access to savings accounts. And the third are small business loans. So that's all we're doing, and that's the actual mechanics of the work we do. But we start by telling all people that they were created in the very image of God, that they were created with dignity and worth and purpose, that God had entrusted them with gifts and abilities, not for their benefit, but entrusted them with gifts and abilities for the benefit, when used, of the neighbors in their community. At Hope, practically we are bankers for the vulnerable. We invest in the dreams of the people we serve, helping them to experience dignity and worth and purpose and the joy of working with their hands. But in India, even though the work itself is quite simple, it's turned out to be really provocative. Because the people that John is working with, those his opponents have dubbed the untouchables, those that are against him realize that the work John's doing threatens their control and it threatens their power. But John believes, as a friend recently wrote, that the gospel is as unstoppable as it is unacceptable. And so he practices this with his whole life, and he's practicing gleaning, and he's seeing incredible results. I opened today with that story talking about this village that we were visiting where the two women interrupted us. And it is a depressing story, but I want to finish it because it has a happy ending. Because as these two women came in, you remember they intervened and interrupted our group meeting, our nice meeting we were having with our donors there, and started lamenting all the things that were wrong with their neighborhood. They started talking about how bad stuff was in their town. But what happened next was that the members of the group that we were serving started to push back on these two naysayers and started to say, yeah, things are still hard. Poverty still exists here. What you're saying in itself isn't true. But for the first time, they said, we have hope. And they talked to their heckling neighbors, and they said, we actually chose to name our community, our group that we're in together, we chose to name it Unity, because we are now standing together. One woman stood up and looked them in the eyes, and she said, and I wrote this in my notebook after she said it, she said, even in hard situations, we know God is looking down on us. Now, this wasn't a woman who had escaped poverty. Far from it. She had a long way to go, but she no longer described herself as helpless. And she was beginning to see herself as God sees her, someone that was created in the image of God. So the trip began on a little bit of a depressing note, but it ended with this beautiful glimpse of hope. After the meeting ended, we took a few minutes and we walked to the homes of the families that we served there. And one of the women pulled me aside and she said, through the translator, she's like, I want to share some pickles with you. I was like, okay, that sounds interesting. Let's do it. So we walked back to her house, our whole group, and she pulled out this jar of pickles. And we learned, had launched a business with the savings she had accumulated with this group, launched a business of creating pickles that she was selling in her community. And she wanted to share one with me and with our group. Now, I don't like pickles. I don't like American pickles. I certainly don't like Indian pickles, but I gladly accepted her gift. And I'm convinced that she was convinced that I loved it. Pickles never tasted so good. It was just something so beautiful about seeing this entrepreneur, this woman created in God's image, who once saw herself as helpless, now was not just providing for her community by selling these pickles, creating these pickles, but she was giving out of her very meager allotment. She was giving a gift to us. It reminded me of the verse from Proverbs where we read, strength and honor are her clothing. She is confident about the future. This woman was no longer a beggar. She was no longer helpless. She was someone that was a giver, someone that saw herself created in the image of God. So today, my encouragement to all of you, no matter what stage of life you're at, is to think through those three questions. What will you farm? How will you farm? And where will you farm? And no matter what the answers to those questions are, I pray that you would really latch on to the practice of gleaning as we read about in Scripture. The practice of farming, not just for the benefit of us, but for the benefit of the most vulnerable and the most marginalized in our midst. Thank you. So I'll open it up for questions. If anyone has any questions about microfinance or about the work that we do in India, and certainly if you want to stick around afterward and talk one-on-one, I'm welcome to do that too. But any questions for the whole group? Yeah.
Do you have any work in Eastern Europe or the former Soviet Union?
Yeah, Hope actually was born out of a failed charity project in Ukraine. So our founder is a home builder and started doing charity through his church after the collapse of the Soviet Union in the 90s. And had been going to Ukraine for a couple of years, taking over huge shipments full of food, clothing, medical supplies. He was one of the big philanthropists behind the project at his church and donated tons of money, used all his vacation time. And then the third year that they went over to Ukraine, a local pastor they were working with there said, listen, I know you're trying to help, but the way you're doing this is actually creating more problems than it's solving. And so Jeff describes it, our founder, Jeff Rutt, he's like, I read the book Toxic Charity, and it's like, I've seriously done every single thing. At that point, I'd done every single thing that they outlined in that book not to do. So when helping hurts was like a huge moment of clarity for him about what that early experience was like. But that's where we began, out of the ashes of that failed charity project. So from there, Jeff, sort of the consummate entrepreneur, came back and started thinking through ways they might be able to help, talking with this local Ukrainian community. And that's when they learned about microfinance, were invited to launch a nonprofit financial institution in Ukraine, became the first organization to have a registered microfinance institution in Ukraine, and that's where we began. So we worked throughout the country. We did have to close one office as a result of Russia's incursion. So we closed one of our offices there, but yeah, we have branch offices throughout the country. And then we have partnerships with 2 organizations, one in Moldova and one in Romania. So we didn't start those organizations, but they're a part of the Hope International network, and we work very closely with them. And again, all locally run. So Ukrainians in Ukraine, Moldovans in Moldova, Romanians in Romania, all Christians view themselves as missionaries doing banking in those places. Other questions? Yeah.
So, if you work in various mission contexts and people haven't been used to, like, the pastor having a business per se,
Yeah.
and therefore it's like countercultural and they're not sure, but the pastor wants to do this, but there's some resistance. Maybe the resistance in the community, or maybe the church itself. How do you overcome that resistance in order to gain some traction and create some change?
Yeah. Certainly the biggest obstacle that we face are people that are trying to help that aren't helping in the countries that we serve. So first of all, the biggest obstacle, even more so than the one you described, like in Haiti, it is so hard to gather groups of people and invite them to start saving together or to make business loans when they can go down the street and get, huge bags of food for free. And honestly, if I'm in that situation, I think it'd be really difficult to trade up the opportunity for, food for the next 2 weeks versus like going to a savings group meeting and, saving money. So that's a huge obstacle. And honestly, it's been the hardest for us to work in places where charity is most prevalent. But in the instances, most of the places where we work around the world, it is very normal for pastors to not be full-time clergy. So that's not as much of an obstacle. The big obstacle we face relating to pastors and businesses isn't, should a pastor run a business, because most of them can't afford to be a clergy, be a pastor without that. The biggest obstacle related to that is when pastors start interfering with people that are running businesses, and or like situations we've been called into a lot of times is where a pastor sets up a microfinance group and he's the one responsible for making loans out to the members of his community. And that almost always ends up being a failure. Either the pastor is hoodwinking the members of his community and charging exorbitant rates or confusing rates that take advantage of people in his community, which we've seen a lot. Or more commonly, what happens is the pastor wants to help, starts typically funded by an American organization, starts making loans out to his community, and all of a sudden, all the people, the loans to typically members of his church, and typically members of, and then shortly thereafter, the members of his church stop coming to church because they don't want to repay the loan. It's really awkward. It creates all kinds of tension. So it's really important that you get the model right, because if the pastor is the loan officer, it can create huge problems. So that's the biggest barrier we face. And sometimes we work in communities where pastors they will only let us work with their community or talk to their community if they're the ones in charge of making loan decisions. And that's just a non-starter for us. If that's the role the pastor wants to play in a community, it's just not going to work.
So what role do you recommend the church then in a context like that?
An American church or the local church?
Local church.
Yeah, so depends on the model. We have 2 distinct models at Hope. The experience for our clients, our customers, is very similar, but one model is where we actually start, like in Ukraine, nonprofit financial institutions. So these are credit unions. They're just like a bank, but they're a nonprofit in the places where we work. So with that model, where it's like we go to that church and be like, we would love for you to come become customers, and we'll train you with biblically based business training, help you set up savings accounts, and then if it's the right fit, help you get a loan to start or expand your business. With our savings group model, which is where it's typically more rural and more poor, there we're actually working exclusively through pastors. So this is what the case was in India. So we work with local pastors, we train up those pastors to go, and this becomes a tool for them to serve their communities like helpless. So the pastor in that community trained this group of women how to set up this savings group, and there's no money coming out and no money going in. So it is all self-contained. So they are saving and lending to one another. They are setting their own interest rates, electing officers, and Hope is the trainer and the facilitator through that local pastor. And those women have no idea that Hope International exists. So where we have a savings group model, we're working, it's a ministry of the Anglican Church or a ministry of the Pentecostal Church or whichever denomination we're working with. And so, yeah, in that case, the pastor gets to do what a pastor should do, serving this community, caring for that community, loving the people, providing this tool for them to use, but he's not a part of the group. And this is in Rwanda where I was there this summer. It was just a beautiful thing. We pulled up to this Anglican church in a rural community in Rwanda, and the local Anglican pastor there took us wound us back to this community where he had set up this savings group. And they had their savings group meeting. We participated in it, got to watch them do that. And the pastor is just cheering them on. And he said to us, he's like, listen, this is a great evangelism strategy for me. He's like, 30% of the people in my church have come to the church as a result of getting to know me and getting to know our church through this savings group ministry. So he, and really with the motto, it is a ministry of the local church. Pastor knows how to do revival meetings, knows how to do vacation Bible school, and savings group ministry becomes like another tool in his toolbox. Yeah.
Really appreciated what you had to say.
Thanks.
I especially appreciated too this approach of when you're speaking to some of these individuals in impoverished communities that they are image bearers of God, starting with that, with worth and value and dignity, etc. But just in general, what would you say is the importance in our conceptions of poverty? You mentioned many. What role does our conception of the person play in how we go about trying to address the poverty we see in front of us?
Yeah, I remember talking to John Bourdet, who's the director of the program in India that I described, about that very question, and said to him, how much like pre-work do you have to do, before these groups actually end up being productive and helpful? And he said, honestly, it's 90% of the work is getting people to the point where they view themselves as worthy. Now, India is probably one of the places where that's most acute. A lot of the places where we work, there wouldn't be that strong oppressive reality for such a huge percentage of the population. But it's huge. I mean, to start, why? John always talks about this, but like, they've been told their whole life not to care, and not to, and your next life is dependent upon accepting your current one. And so it is a radical proposition to consider asking the question, am I created for more than destitution? So India, it's definitely most extreme, and this is one of the things at Hope I'm most excited about, but we've just seen this amazing movement among the 16 countries where we work of our leaders, all local to the communities where they're asking, hearing stories like that from John, and just asking the question, who are the most disenfranchised, marginalized, overlooked people groups in our community? So out of some of these conversations, we launched a ministry with the Roma people in Eastern Europe, often called the gypsy populations, but people that they're totally ostracized. Even among Christians in Ukraine, they hold the Roma people at arm's length. They're considered dirty. They're often characterized as being thieves and beggars, and so they live totally insular lives. But our staff in Ukraine started to sense God asking them to take a risk to go serve the Roma people. So we launched a Roma ministry last year in Ukraine and Moldova and Romania. Similar in Central Africa with the Twa people. It's often we call them the pygmies. That our staff there, typically there have been huge barriers between Christians locally and even this people group that exists in their own neighborhood or in their own cities. So that's been really exciting. So I think that to answer your question, it's a huge part of what we do. And it's even more so recently, forcing ourselves to say, are we working with the safe communities within Rwanda, or are we working in the underserved and overlooked communities within Rwanda? And when you're trying to create great performance, sometimes you just go to the places of least resistance. But the reality is, in a place like Rwanda, in a place like India, the commercial banks are growing like crazy. Technology is allowing mobile banking and other things to expand into places. So we ought to be going to those places that are so difficult to serve in and overlooked, and not just going for the lowest hanging fruit. So it's been a really interesting renewal within Hope over the past few years. I think we have time for one more question, if anyone has one.
Well,
Yes.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, I'm from a continent where it has been proven that foreign aid is not really helping the
Mm.
vulnerable.
Mm.
And indeed, to be open, what would be your advice to the church or those who are blessed to be a blessing
Mm.
on how to be open to the vulnerable?
Yeah, thank you. And you're right. I mean, the data is pretty convincing that a lot of our international aid and charity and missionary efforts, in some cases, are creating more problems than they're solving. It's so hard to prescribe a solution for the community where you work without knowing what exists there. And so I think the first question I would perhaps give you and say, like, what things are going well in my community? Where am I seeing assets? And build around those assets as opposed to what might appear like the needs. So if it's a place where there is a robust soil and place for farming, then perhaps becoming an expert in farming technology might be just the right solution. If you're close to a natural water source, so it just depends. I really don't know. I wish I could be more helpful, but if you're interested specifically in microfinance and in this area of financial services and banking, then I'm happy to talk with you afterward and get some specifics of where you work and give you a couple of tools online that can point you to what microfinance organizations are working in that country right now and what specific areas of the country where they're working. So that could be a good step if you're interested in microfinance. Thank you so much. Again, I'll be sticking around. I'll be over at dinner. So if anybody wants to talk more about microfinance, talk more about about gleaning, I'm happy to do that. Thank you.